I didn't wake up that day expecting my life to change forever. It began like any other morning, a routine steeped in predictability. Where the concerns of the world felt distant yet heavy, my focus was singular, rooted in completing a 150-mile charity bike ride. It was a clear September morning, with a steady headwind promising to test my endurance. Despite the challenge, I felt ready to push myself, fueled by a cause that deeply resonated with me. About 45 miles into the ride, things began to unravel. A flat tire delayed me significantly, and though I managed to fix it, the setback left me racing against the wind alone, with no group to shield me from its force. Determined not to fail, I pushed harder than ever. However, the effort was taking its toll. By the time I reached the 65-mile mark, my body felt as though it were shutting down. The nurses on the support crew noticed my condition and urged me to stop. Despite their intervention, I collapsed under the bridge, staring at the vast blue sky above as the world began to fade away. At that moment, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. I had always seen life as a struggle, one filled with fleeting joys overshadowed by a harsh reality. Death didn't scare me, it felt like an escape. I silently surrendered, letting go of the weight I had carried for so long. What followed, however, was far from the oblivion I had expected. As I lay there, I became acutely aware of a shift in my consciousness. It was as though my mind had expanded, breaking free from the confines of my physical body. I expected darkness, silence, and an end to awareness. Instead, I found myself more alert than I had ever been, experiencing what can only be described as a superconscious state. Thoughts flowed freely, and with them came a profound clarity I had never known before. Suddenly, my perspective shifted. I was no longer confined to the ground but floating, weightless, in a space that defied logic. My surroundings transformed into an indescribable expanse, alive with energy and vibrational frequencies. It felt as if my very essence had disintegrated into countless strings of light, each pulsating with a rhythm that resonated through my being. Time and space lost their meaning. I was everywhere and nowhere all at once. The sensation was exhilarating. For the first time in my existence, I felt truly at peace, untethered by fear or doubt. Despite the strangeness of my surroundings, I couldn't help but marvel at the beauty unfolding around me. It was as though I had been transported to a dimension of infinite possibilities, where the boundaries of reality dissolved. In this state of wonder, I became aware of a presence. At first, it was subtle, a gentle vibration that seemed to emanate from the space around me. Then, as I attuned my awareness, the presence grew stronger, enveloping me in a warmth that felt both familiar and otherworldly. Though I couldn't see, hear, or touch in the traditional sense, I knew I was not alone. Gradually, the presence materialized into beings of light, their forms ethereal yet distinct. They surrounded me, exuding a love so pure and unconditional that it brought tears to my soul. These beings felt like family, though not in the earthly sense. Their love was not tied to obligation or history, it was simply a natural extension of their essence. Unable to speak, I communicated through thought, sending them my gratitude and reassurance that I was not afraid. To my surprise, they responded, their thoughts merging with mine in a symphony of understanding. They conveyed their joy at my arrival, though it was clear that my presence there was unexpected. Just as I began to settle into this newfound peace, the atmosphere shifted. The beings, who had been radiating love and light, suddenly withdrew, bowing in unison. Confused, I tried to understand what was happening. Then, I felt it, a presence so powerful that it eclipsed everything I had experienced thus far. This presence wasn't merely in the room, it was the room. The light, the air, the very fabric of existence. As the presence drew closer, I felt an overwhelming sense of humility. When it reached me, it took on a form, a figure of unparalleled majesty and grace. Though I couldn't see with my eyes, I knew with absolute certainty that this was a being of divine origin. Its essence radiated authority and compassion, a perfect balance that defied comprehension. The figure leaned close, and though I still lacked physical senses, I could feel it smile. Its words resonated directly within me. bypassing language to reach the core of my being. "My child," it said gently, "why are you here? It is not your time." I wanted to protest, to explain that I was tired, that the world had been too much. But before I could, the figure continued, its tone filled with understanding. "Do not fear your return. Live your life as fully as you can, and show the same love you have received here to those you meet. Let me handle the rest." In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. This wasn't a rejection, it was a redirection. A reminder that my journey wasn't over. Though I longed to stay in this place of peace, I understood that my time there was temporary. The figure reached out, lifting me with a tenderness that melted my resistance. Together, we began the journey back, a descent through the vast expanse I had marveled at moments before. As we neared the earthly realm, I felt my senses returning, each one grounding me in a reality I no longer feared. The transition was jarring. One moment, I was enveloped in divine love, the next, I was back in my broken body, gasping for air as the nurses around me worked frantically to revive me. Though the pain returned with shocking intensity, it couldn't erase the peace I had carried back with me. As I opened my eyes, I realized that the world had not changed, but I had. The journey I had taken, though brief, had altered my understanding of life and death forever. Opening my eyes to the bright sunlight and the concerned faces of the nurses felt like waking from the most profound dream. Except it wasn't a dream. My body ached in ways I couldn't describe, and the exhaustion was overwhelming. But my soul carried a sense of peace I had never known before. The world around me had not changed, yet it felt as though I was seeing everything through a new lens. The nurses' voices sounded distant at first, their hurried words muffled by the weight of my return. "He's back," one of them exclaimed, relief evident in her tone. Another nurse was taking my pulse, her hands trembling slightly as she confirmed that my heartbeat had stabilized. I wanted to reassure them, to tell them that everything was fine, but I was too weak to speak. Instead, I managed a faint smile, which seemed to ease their tension. As the minutes passed, I became more aware of my surroundings. The familiar discomforts of earthly life were all there, the cold wind biting at my skin, the dull ache in my muscles, the cacophony of concerned voices, but they no longer felt overwhelming. Instead, they served as reminders of the contrast between this world and the one I had just experienced. I couldn't help but marvel at the fragility of human existence, at how easily we take for granted the delicate balance that keeps us alive. The journey back to the starting point of the charity ride was a blur. I was placed on a trailer alongside other exhausted cyclists, their faces reflecting a mixture of concern and determination. Though my body was weak, my spirit felt alive in a way it never had before. I found myself silently observing the people around me, seeing them not just as individuals but as intricate, interconnected souls. Each person carried their own struggles, their own joys, their own fears, yet all of it seemed part of a greater whole. When we arrived at the finish line, the other cyclists encouraged me to get back on my bike and complete the ride. They thought it was important for me to cross the finish line, to feel a sense of accomplishment. I appreciated their encouragement, but in my heart, I knew that no earthly achievement could compare to the journey I had just taken. Still, I complied, pushing myself to pedal the final stretch with the last remnants of my strength. Crossing that finish line felt insignificant compared to the deeper understanding I now carried. But it brought a smile to their faces, and that was enough for me. In the days and weeks that followed, I grappled with the enormity of what had happened. How could I put into words an experience that defied language? How could I explain to others the unconditional love I had felt? The profound sense of purpose that now anchored my life? Every attempt to describe it felt inadequate, like trying to capture the vastness of the ocean in a single drop of water. I began to notice subtle changes in myself. My perspective on life shifted dramatically. Where once I had seen the world as cruel and indifferent, I now saw it as a complex tapestry woven with threads of love, resilience, and divine intention. I no longer viewed challenges as insurmountable obstacles but as opportunities for growth and connection. Even mundane moments carried a new sense of significance, as if each one was a piece of a larger, more meaningful puzzle. One of the most profound realizations I carried back with me was the importance of love. The beings I had encountered radiated a love so pure and unconditional that it transcended anything I had ever experienced on Earth. It wasn't tied to actions or achievements, it simply existed. An eternal force that bound everything together. This love wasn't something to be earned or deserved, it was freely given. A gift that flowed from the very essence of existence. Inspired by this realization, I made a conscious effort to embody that love in my daily life. I found myself listening more intently to others, offering kindness without expecting anything in return, and seeking ways to connect with people on a deeper level. It wasn't always easy, old habits and frustrations still lingered, but the memory of that love served as a constant reminder of what truly mattered. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of my transformation was reconciling my experience with my previous beliefs. Before the accident, I had considered myself a strange Christian, someone who participated in religious activities more out of obligation than genuine faith. My relationship with spirituality had been distant, shaped more by skepticism than conviction. Yet the encounter I had during my near-death experience shattered those preconceptions. It wasn't about dogma or rituals, it was about a personal connection to something infinitely greater than myself. As I reflected on the divine figure who had spoken to me, I couldn't help but wonder about its identity. Was it Jesus Christ, as my upbringing suggested, or was it a representation of something more universal? A manifestation of the divine that transcends labels and religious boundaries? The figure hadn't explicitly identified itself, leaving me with more questions than answers. Yet, in a way, the ambiguity felt intentional. It wasn't about who or what the figure was, it was about the message it carried. The figure's words echoed in my mind constantly. Live your life the best way you can. Show unconditional love to those you meet. Let me handle the rest. Those simple instructions became my guiding principles, a compass that pointed me toward a life of greater purpose and meaning. The figure hadn't asked me to preach or convert others, it had simply asked me to live with love and integrity, trusting that even small acts of kindness could have a ripple effect far beyond what I could see. As I continued to navigate the complexities of life, I found solace in the knowledge that I was not alone. The beings of light, the overwhelming love, the sense of interconnectedness, all of it remained with me. A quiet presence that reminded me of the deeper truths I had glimpsed. Though the memory of my experience began to fade over time, its impact on my life remained as vivid as ever. The journey was far from over. I knew there would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and difficulty, but I also knew that the love I had experienced was an unshakable foundation, a source of strength that would carry me through whatever came next. And so, with a renewed sense of purpose, I stepped forward, ready to embrace life with open arms and an open heart. Returning to the routine of daily life felt surreal. I was alive, yes, but no longer the same person. My near-death experience had shattered the way I understood the world and my place in it. Each morning, as I opened my eyes, I felt a strange mix of gratitude and melancholy. Gratitude for another day to live and experience life, and melancholy for the profound connection I had felt during my journey that seemed so distant in the noise of earthly existence. The first challenge I faced was explaining what had happened to those around me. Friends and family were curious but also skeptical. When I tried to describe the beings of light or the immense unconditional love I had experienced, I could see their faces shift, some with fascination, others with thinly veiled disbelief. My closest friends listened attentively but struggled to grasp the depth of what I was sharing. What was it like? My best friend asked one evening over coffee. I hesitated, trying to distill the indescribable into words. It felt like coming home, I said finally, but not home as we know it. It was a home made of love, where everything just made sense. He nodded, though I could see he didn't fully understand. And how could he? Words were inadequate to convey the vastness of what I had experienced. As the days turned into weeks, I noticed subtle but persistent changes in my behavior. I was more patient, less reactive. Situations that would have once frustrated or angered me now felt insignificant. A rude stranger in a grocery line or a missed deadline at work barely registered as nuisances. Instead, I found myself focusing on the humanity behind every interaction. What might that rude stranger be going through? How could I help ease someone else's stress rather than adding to it? Yet, not all changes were easy or comfortable. I began questioning the priorities I had held before the accident. My career, my possessions, even some of my relationships, all seemed less important when measured against the eternal truths I had encountered. This shift created tension in areas where others expected me to remain the same. At work, colleagues commented on how I seemed more introspective, less driven. My boss, though kind, questioned whether my heart was still in the job. It's not that I don't care about the work, I explained during a meeting. It's just, I see it differently now. The goals feel smaller. He nodded, understanding but concerned. Take some time to figure it out, he offered, but don't lose sight of what you've built here. His words lingered in my mind. What had I built? Was it truly significant, or had I spent years climbing a ladder that leaned against the wrong wall? These were the questions that now occupied my thoughts. The second challenge came in the form of doubt, both from others and within myself. While I had no doubt about the reality of my experience, the logical part of my mind struggled to reconcile it with the world of science and facts I had trusted for so long. The experience had been so vivid, so real, yet it defied everything I thought I knew about the nature of life and death. One evening, I decided to search for others who had experienced something similar. I found forums and communities dedicated to near-death experiences, filled with people sharing their own incredible stories. Reading their accounts brought me comfort and validation. Many described the same overwhelming love, the sense of interconnectedness, and the difficulty of reintegration. I wasn't alone, and neither were they. Through these communities, I learned the term aftereffects, used to describe the lasting changes in people who have had near-death experiences. Increased empathy, a diminished fear of death, heightened intuition. These traits were all familiar to me now, but they came with challenges. 2. Feeling disconnected from societal norms, struggling to articulate the experience, and occasionally feeling isolated in a world that seemed preoccupied with superficial concerns. One recurring theme in the stories I read was the idea of a mission. Many people who returned from near-death experiences felt they had been sent back for a reason. This resonated deeply with me. The royal figure I had encountered, whether it was Jesus or another manifestation of divine love, had made it clear that my role was to live with love and share it with others. But how could I best fulfill that purpose? Was it enough to live a life of kindness? Or was there something more I was meant to do? The answer came in small, unexpected moments. A conversation with a struggling coworker where my newfound perspective offered comfort. A spontaneous act of generosity that brought a stranger to tears. A letter from an old friend who said my words had inspired her to reconnect with her family. Each instance reminded me that the ripple effects of love and compassion were far-reaching, even if I couldn't always see where they led. Over time, I began to view my life as a series of opportunities to plant seeds of love and understanding. Whether those seeds grew into towering trees or remained hidden beneath the soil was not for me to decide. My role was simply to sow them wherever I went. One of the most profound realizations I carried with me was that belief or disbelief in a higher power didn't determine a person's worth or destiny. The royal figure's words, "Don't be afraid if people believe in me or not," replayed in my mind often. It was a reminder that my job wasn't to convince anyone of anything. Instead, it was to live as a testament to the love I had experienced and let that love speak for itself. This realization freed me from the pressure of needing to save anyone. It wasn't about proselytizing or debating theology. It was about embodying the values of compassion, understanding, and grace. I learned to meet people where they were, respecting their beliefs and journeys while sharing my own truth in a way that felt authentic and unassuming. Though I still had moments of doubt and confusion, they no longer consumed me. The memory of my near-death experience remained a guiding light, reminding me of the eternal connection that underpinned all of existence. I didn't have all the answers, but I no longer needed them. The love I had encountered was enough, more than enough, to sustain me as I navigated this imperfect, beautiful, and fleeting life. Each day, I moved forward with a little more clarity, a little more purpose, and a lot more love. And in doing so, I felt closer to the divine truth I had touched, knowing it was always with me, even here on earth. As weeks turned into months, the sense of connection to the divine began to settle into the rhythm of my daily life. At first, I worried that the glow of my near-death experience would fade, that the depth of love and clarity I had felt would become just another distant memory. But instead, it became a quiet undercurrent, a reminder that would rise to the surface in unexpected moments, infusing even the most mundane activities with a sense of purpose. I began to see my relationships in a new light. Before, I had often taken people for granted, assuming there would always be time to mend fences or say the things that needed to be said. Now, I understood that time is both fleeting and precious. Every interaction became an opportunity to express gratitude, love, or forgiveness. One evening, I reached out to an old friend I had fallen out with years ago over a trivial disagreement. We hadn't spoken in nearly a decade, and I wasn't sure how my message would be received. To my surprise, she responded almost immediately, expressing relief that I had reached out. "I've thought about you so often," she wrote. "I didn't know how to fix things. Neither of us cared anymore about the argument that had driven us apart. We spoke for hours, sharing stories and laughter, and by the end of the call, it felt as though no time had passed." I hung up with tears in my eyes, grateful for the chance to repair something I had once thought lost. Moments like these became more common as I leaned into the lessons I had learned. My relationships deepened, not because they were perfect, but because I approached them with more vulnerability and honesty. I realized that showing love didn't mean avoiding conflict, it meant facing it with courage and compassion. At work, I found myself drawn to mentoring younger colleagues. It wasn't an official role, but whenever someone seemed overwhelmed or unsure, I would invite them for coffee and share whatever wisdom I could. One young intern confided in me about her struggles with imposter syndrome, feeling like she didn't belong in the fast-paced corporate world. "I know what that feels like," I told her, "but let me tell you something. You're here for a reason. You have something to offer that no one else does. Don't let doubt steal that from you." She smiled through tears, and in that moment, I realized that perhaps my purpose wasn't tied to some grand, sweeping mission. Maybe it was as simple as being present for the people around me, offering encouragement and kindness whenever I could. Despite the peace I found in these small acts, there were still challenges. Some days, the weight of the world's suffering felt unbearable. Watching the news or scrolling through social media, I would see stories of violence, injustice, and despair. It was easy to feel powerless in the face of so much pain. But then I would remember the words of the royal figure who had sent me back. "Just live your life the best way you can and try to show unconditional love for the people you meet." Those words reminded me that I wasn't responsible for fixing the world. My role was to contribute what I could, where I could, and trust that the ripples of those actions would reach farther than I could see. One day, I decided to volunteer at a local shelter. The work was humbling, serving meals, organizing donations, and sitting with people who were navigating hardships I could barely imagine. But it was also profoundly fulfilling. Listening to their stories, I was reminded of the resilience of the human spirit. Despite everything they had endured, many of them still found ways to smile, to hope, and to extend kindness to others. One woman, a single mother of two, told me how she had lost her home after an unexpected medical emergency wiped out her savings. "I don't know what's next," she admitted, her voice trembling, "but I'm not giving up. I can't, my kids are counting on me." Her determination moved me deeply. I saw in her the same strength and grace that I had felt during my near-death experience. It was a reminder that the divine was present in all of us, even in the midst of struggle. As I continued to navigate this new chapter of my life, I began to feel a sense of balance. I wasn't chasing perfection or trying to live up to some idealized version of myself. Instead, I focused on living authentically, embracing both my strengths and my flaws. I made mistakes, of course, I was still human, but I no longer let those mistakes define me. Instead, I saw them as opportunities to learn and grow. Perhaps the most significant change was my relationship with fear. Before my near-death experience, I had often been paralyzed by the fear of failure, rejection, or the unknown, but now, those fears felt trivial in the grand scheme of things. I knew, with unshakable certainty, that I was part of something much greater than myself, something eternal and unbreakable. This newfound courage allowed me to take risks I would have avoided in the past. I started painting again, a hobby I had abandoned years ago because I didn't think I was good enough. I signed up for a public speaking workshop, despite my lifelong fear of standing in front of an audience. And perhaps most significantly, I began to share my story more openly. At first, I was hesitant to talk about my near-death experience outside of the safe spaces I had found online. I worried about being judged or dismissed as delusional. But as I started to open up, I was amazed at the response. People listened with rapt attention, often sharing their own experiences of loss, faith, or moments of clarity. It's like you're describing something I've always felt but couldn't put into words. One listener told me after a community talk I gave, hearing that reaffirmed my belief that sharing my story wasn't just about me. It was about creating connections and reminding people of the love and light that exists within and around us all. Through it all, I held onto the memory of that royal figure, the way they had looked at me with such infinite love and understanding. Whenever I felt lost or overwhelmed, I would close my eyes and picture that smile. It reminded me that I was never truly alone, that I was always held by something greater than myself. And so, I continued to move forward, step by step, guided by the light I had seen and the love I had felt. My journey wasn't over, far from it, but I no longer feared what lay ahead. Instead, I embraced it with open arms, knowing that every moment, no matter how small, was an opportunity to live with purpose, compassion, and grace. The further I journeyed from the moment of my near-death experience, the more profound its impact became. It was as if the layers of meaning were unfolding over time, revealing lessons I hadn't fully grasped in those initial moments. One of the most significant changes was my relationship with faith, not just in the divine, but in humanity, in life, and in myself. Before my experience, faith had always felt like an abstract concept. I had believed in something greater than myself, but I hadn't fully understood what that belief meant or how it could shape my life. Now, faith felt tangible, like a living, breathing presence that infused everything I did. It wasn't about adhering to a specific set of rules or doctrines, it was about trust. Trust in the inherent goodness of life, even when it felt chaotic or uncertain. Trust in the connections between people, even when they seemed fractured. And trust in the guidance I had received during my time beyond the veil. This new perspective wasn't without its challenges. I often found myself wrestling with questions I couldn't answer. Why do some people suffer so much while others seem to glide through life with ease? How could I reconcile the beauty I had experienced with the pain I saw in the world? These questions didn't have easy answers, but I began to see them not as barriers to faith, but as invitations to explore it more deeply. One day, I found myself speaking with a close friend who was going through a difficult time. She had recently lost her job and was struggling to find her footing. As she poured out her frustrations, she said something that struck me deeply. "I just don't understand why this is happening to me," she said, her voice tinged with despair. "What's the point of trying so hard if everything can fall apart in an instant?" Her words echoed thoughts I had wrestled with many times before. But now, I felt a clarity I hadn't had in the past. "I don't think it's about understanding why things happen," I said gently. "I think it's about finding meaning in how we respond to them. Maybe the point isn't to have all the answers, but to keep moving forward, even when it's hard." She looked at me, her eyes brimming with tears. "How do you do that? How do you keep going when everything feels so heavy?" I thought for a moment before replying. "For me, it's about remembering that I'm part of something bigger than myself. Even when I can't see the whole picture, I trust that there's a purpose to it all, and I try to focus on the small things I can do to make a difference, even if they feel insignificant." That conversation stayed with me long after it ended. It reminded me that faith wasn't just about grand, life-altering revelations. It was also about the quiet, everyday choices we make to keep showing up, to keep trying, and to keep believing in the possibility of goodness. As I continued to share my story, I encountered a wide range of reactions. Some people were deeply moved, finding resonance in my experiences. Others were skeptical, questioning whether what I had experienced was real or just a figment of my imagination. At first, I found the skepticism difficult to navigate. I wanted people to understand the profound truth of what I had experienced, to see the world through the lens I had been given. But over time, I realized that it wasn't my job to convince anyone of anything. My role was simply to share my story and let it speak for itself. One evening, after giving a talk at a local community center, a man approached me. He looked to be in his 60s, with kind eyes and a hesitant smile. "I wanted to thank you for sharing your story," he said. "I've always struggled with the idea of faith. I've wanted to believe in something, but I've never been able to. Hearing you talk about your experience, it made me wonder if maybe there's more out there than I've allowed myself to see." His words filled me with a sense of purpose. It wasn't about converting anyone to a particular belief system or proving the existence of the divine. It was about opening the door to possibility, showing people that there was more to life than what we could see or measure. In my quieter moments, I found myself reflecting on the royal figure who had appeared to me during my near-death experience. Their presence had been so vivid, so full of love and wisdom. I often wondered if I would ever encounter them again, whether in this life or beyond. But even if I didn't, I carried their message with me, to live my life the best way I could, to love unconditionally, and to trust in the unfolding of a greater plan. This message became my guiding light, shaping the way I approached every aspect of my life. It didn't mean I was perfect or that I had everything figured out. There were still days when I felt lost or overwhelmed, when the weight of the world seemed too much to bear. But even in those moments, I held on to the knowledge that I was not alone. I was part of something infinite and eternal, a tapestry of love and connection that wove through every soul and every moment. As I looked ahead, I didn't know what the future would hold, but I no longer felt the need to control or predict it. Instead, I embraced each day as it came, trusting that whatever lay ahead would bring with it opportunities for growth, connection, and grace. And in that trust, I found a peace that surpassed anything I had ever known. Returning to life after my near-death experience was both a blessing and a challenge. On one hand, I was filled with a renewed sense of purpose and a deep connection to the divine. On the other, the ordinary routines of life felt almost trivial in comparison to the vastness of what I had seen. How could I reconcile the enormity of that experience with the mundanity of daily existence? The first few weeks were surreal. Every moment seemed imbued with new meaning, as if I were seeing the world for the first time. The trees seemed greener, the sky bluer, and every interaction felt like a sacred exchange. Yet, at the same time, I found myself longing for the peace and clarity I had experienced during those precious moments beyond the veil. It was as if part of me had remained there, tethered to that realm of unconditional love and understanding. One day, while walking through the park, I stopped to watch a group of children playing. Their laughter was infectious, and their boundless energy reminded me of the simplicity of joy. For a moment, I was struck by the realization that this fleeting, beautiful moment was part of the same grand tapestry I had glimpsed during my experience. Life, with all its imperfections and uncertainties, was still a miracle. It was in that moment that I began to understand the balance between the extraordinary and the ordinary. The divine wasn't something separate from life, it was woven into the fabric of every experience. From the mundane to the profound, my task wasn't to escape the ordinary but to see the extraordinary within it. This realization led me to approach my relationships with a new perspective. I became more intentional about the time I spent with loved ones, seeking to truly connect with them rather than simply going through the motions. I found myself listening more deeply, not just to their words but to the emotions and intentions behind them. And I began to notice how small acts of kindness, a smile, a kind word, or a simple gesture of support, could create ripples of positivity that extended far beyond the moment. There was one interaction in particular that stayed with me. A close friend of mine, who had always struggled with self-doubt, confided in me about a difficult decision she was facing. As she spoke, I could sense the weight of her uncertainty and fear. Drawing on the lessons I had learned, I encouraged her to trust herself, to listen to the quiet voice within that often gets drowned out by fear and doubt. It's not about getting everything right, I told her. It's about having faith in your ability to navigate whatever comes your way. You're stronger and wiser than you realize. Tears welled up in her eyes as she thanked me. And in that moment, I realized that sharing the love and understanding I had experienced during my near-death journey wasn't just a calling, it was a responsibility. Yet, as much as I sought to live out these lessons, there were still moments of doubt. The world could be overwhelming, with its constant noise and chaos. There were times when I questioned whether my experience had really happened. Whether it was a figment of my imagination or a dream conjured by my brain in its final moments. But whenever those doubts crept in, I would close my eyes and return to the memory of that place, the light, the love, the presence of the royal figure who had guided me. It was more real to me than anything I had ever known. And that truth became my anchor. As time went on, I began to see how my experience could help others. I started speaking to small groups, at community centers, churches, and even hospitals, sharing my story and the insights I had gained. At first, I worried about how my words would be received. Would people think I was making it up? Would they dismiss me as delusional or overly sentimental? But as I stood before each group, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. This wasn't about convincing anyone of anything. It was about offering my truth and trusting that it would reach those who needed it. In one of these talks, a young woman approached me afterward. She had recently lost her father and was struggling to make sense of her grief. "Your story gave me hope," she said, her voice trembling. "It reminded me that my dad isn't really gone, that he's still connected to us in some way." Her words brought tears to my eyes. This was why I had been given the gift of that experience, not to hoard it for myself, but to share it with others, to remind them of the infinite love and connection that underpins our existence. Over time, my perspective on life and death shifted even further. I began to see death not as an ending, but as a transition, a doorway into a greater reality. This didn't mean that loss wasn't painful or that grief wasn't valid. It simply meant that there was more to the story than we could see from our limited vantage point. I also began to embrace the idea of growth through imperfection. During my near-death experience, the royal figure had told me not to fear making mistakes, to live my life the best way I could, and to trust in their guidance. This permission to be imperfect was liberating. It allowed me to approach challenges with a sense of curiosity rather than dread. To see failures as opportunities for learning rather than as evidence of inadequacy. One of the most surprising lessons I learned was the importance of humility. My experience had given me profound insights, but it had also taught me how little I truly knew. The universe was vast and mysterious, and my understanding of it was just a tiny drop in an infinite ocean. This humility became a source of strength, reminding me to approach life with openness and wonder rather than certainty and pride. As I continued to navigate the complexities of life, I held onto the memory of the unconditional love I had experienced. It became a compass, guiding me back to what truly mattered: connection, compassion, and the courage to live authentically. And while the journey was far from over, I knew that I wasn't walking it alone. That love was always with me, woven into every step I took. The more I shared my story, the more I realized how universal the themes of my near-death experience were. People from all walks of life, regardless of their backgrounds, found pieces of their own journeys reflected in mine. This connection became a source of strength and humility for me, as I began to see how intricately our lives were woven together in ways we rarely comprehend. As I navigated this new chapter, I started to see life itself as a kind of spiritual practice. Every interaction, every challenge, and every choice was an opportunity to bring a bit more light into the world. I came to understand that my experience wasn't about achieving some grand purpose but about infusing purpose into the smallest moments. One afternoon, I was sitting on a park bench, watching the gentle sway of the trees in the breeze. A woman approached me, her face etched with worry. She asked if she could sit, and I nodded. After a few moments of silence, she began to share her struggles. She had just lost her job and was grappling with feelings of failure and fear about the future. As I listened, I felt a familiar warmth rise within me, the same energy I had experienced in the presence of the royal figure during my near-death journey. It was a reminder that love and understanding weren't limited to extraordinary moments. They could flow through us at any time if we allowed them. "You're not defined by this moment," I told her gently. "Sometimes life pushes us in directions we don't expect, not to punish us, but to guide us to something greater. You have everything you need to navigate this, even if it doesn't feel that way right now." Her eyes welled with tears as she thanked me, and in that moment, I realized that the most profound impact we can have is often through the simplest acts of kindness. It wasn't about having all the answers, it was about showing up with an open heart. Over time, I began to notice a recurring theme in the stories people shared with me. Many felt disconnected, not just from others, but from themselves. They described feeling as though they were going through the motions of life without truly living. It reminded me of the moments in my own life when I had felt untethered, searching for meaning but unsure of where to find it. Drawing on the lessons of my experience, I started encouraging others to look inward, to reconnect with the quiet voice within that so often gets drowned out by the noise of the world. I shared how, during my near-death journey, I had felt more connected to my true self than ever before, not because of anything external, but because I had been stripped of all the distractions and fears that usually cloud our vision. You don't have to wait for a life-altering event to find that connection, I told them. It's always there, waiting for you to notice it. Start by simply being present with yourself, with others, with the world around you. This practice of presence became a cornerstone of my own life. Whenever I felt overwhelmed or uncertain, I would take a few moments to pause, breathe, and center myself in the present moment. It wasn't always easy. Life has a way of pulling us in a million directions, but each time I returned to that place of stillness, I felt a sense of clarity and peace. One of the most surprising aspects of this journey was how my relationships deepened. Friends and family began opening up to me in ways they never had before, sharing their fears, hopes, and dreams. I realized that my experience had given me not just a story to tell, but a capacity to hold space for others, to be a witness to their struggles and triumphs without judgment. In one particularly poignant conversation, a close friend confided in me about a mistake she had made years ago that she couldn't forgive herself for. As she spoke, I was reminded of the royal figure's words during my near-death experience. "Don't be afraid when you return back to Earth and make mistakes. Just live your life the best way you can." I shared this with her, and we sat in silence for a moment, letting the words sink in. Finally, she looked at me and said, "Maybe it's time I stop carrying this with me. Maybe it's time I forgive myself." Her vulnerability was a gift, and it reaffirmed for me the power of compassion, not just for others, but for ourselves. We're all doing the best we can with what we have, and grace is as much about offering it to ourselves as it is about extending it to those around us. As I continued to navigate life, I began to see the ripples of my near-death experience everywhere. It wasn't just in the big moments or the profound insights, it was in the laughter of children, the kindness of strangers, and the quiet beauty of a sunset. Each of these moments was a reminder of the interconnectedness of all things, of the love that underpins everything, even when we can't see it. One evening, as I sat alone reflecting on my journey, I felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over me, for the experience that had changed my life. Yes, but also for the ordinary moments that had followed. They were the threads that wove together the tapestry of my life, each one as essential as the last. I didn't have all the answers, and I knew I never would, but that was okay. The point wasn't to figure everything out, it was to live fully, love deeply, and trust that, even in the midst of uncertainty, we're exactly where we're meant to be. As the weeks turned into months, the lessons from my near-death experience began to feel less like revelations and more like a natural part of my being. It wasn't that I had stopped learning or reflecting, far from it. Instead, I had started to integrate those lessons into my everyday life, allowing them to guide my decisions, relationships, and outlook. One of the most profound shifts was in how I viewed the unknown. Before my experience, uncertainty had often been a source of anxiety for me. I wanted to control outcomes, to have a plan, to know what was coming next. But my time in that other realm had shown me that the unknown wasn't something to be feared, it was a space of infinite potential. This realization came into sharp focus one afternoon when I was invited to speak at a local community center. The organizer had heard about my story and thought it would resonate with their group, many of whom were going through significant life transitions. I hesitated at first. Sharing my story was deeply personal, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to do it in front of strangers. But then I remembered the royal figure's words, "Don't be afraid when you return back to Earth. Just live your life the best way you can." So, I said yes. The day of the event, I stood in front of a small but attentive audience. My hands trembled slightly as I began to speak. But as I shared my journey, the struggles, the revelations, and the moments of grace, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. People nodded, some wiped away tears, and a few even approached me afterward to share their own stories. One woman, in particular, stood out. She was in her early 60s and had recently lost her husband of 40 years. She told me that she had been struggling to find a reason to keep going, feeling as though her life had lost its meaning. "Your story reminded me that I'm still here for a reason," she said, her voice trembling. "Maybe I don't know what that reason is yet, but that's okay. I'll figure it out." Her words stayed with me long after the event ended. They were a reminder that we're all walking our own paths, often stumbling in the dark, but always moving forward, and sometimes, simply continuing to walk is enough. This encounter led me to start volunteering at a grief support group. It was humbling to sit with people in their pain, to witness their raw emotions and the courage it took for them to keep going. I didn't have all the answers, but I didn't need to. My role was to listen, to hold space, and to remind them, through my presence, if not my words, that they weren't alone. Through this work, I began to see the beauty in the vulnerability that comes with not knowing. It's in those moments of uncertainty that we're most open to growth, connection, and transformation. The unknown isn't a void, it's a doorway. I also started to notice how often people tried to fill that void with distractions, work, technology, endless to-do lists. I wasn't immune to this tendency myself. There were days when I found myself scrolling aimlessly on my phone or getting lost in the minutiae of daily life. But each time I caught myself, I tried to return to the present moment, to the stillness I had felt during my near-death experience. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a familiar warmth envelop me. It was the same energy I had felt in the presence of the royal figure. A reminder that even in the simplest moments, there is divinity. The fading light painted the sky in hues of orange and pink. And I realized that life, in all its complexity, is a series of these small, sacred moments. This sense of sacredness began to influence how I approached everything, from the way I spoke to others to the way I moved through my day. I started to see every interaction, every decision, as an opportunity to embody the unconditional love I had experienced. It wasn't always easy. There were times when I was impatient or distracted, times when I fell short. But each time, I reminded myself that it was okay. Perfection wasn't the goal, presence was. As I continued to share my story, both formally and informally, I noticed a recurring question. What do you think happens after we die? People were curious, sometimes even desperate, to understand what lay beyond this life. I always answered honestly, I don't have all the answers, but I can tell you what I experienced. And what I experienced was love. This simple statement often brought a sense of relief. It wasn't about convincing anyone or proving anything, it was about sharing what I knew to be true. And in doing so, I found that I was also reminding myself. Each time I spoke about my experience, it deepened my own understanding of it, solidifying the lessons I had learned and grounding me in the present. One day, as I was journaling, I wrote a simple phrase that seemed to encapsulate everything I had come to believe. The unknown is where life begins. It's where we discover who we are, what we're capable of, and how deeply we can connect with others. It's where we find the courage to step forward, even when we're not sure where the path will lead. Looking back on my journey, I saw how much I had changed, not just because of my near-death experience, but because of what I had done with it. The experience itself was a gift. But the real transformation came from integrating its lessons into my life. It wasn't about living a perfect life, it was about living an authentic one. Guided by love, curiosity, and a willingness to embrace the unknown. And so, I continued to walk the path before me, one step at a time, trusting that each step would lead me exactly where I needed to be. As the seasons passed, my focus shifted from merely recounting my near-death experience to living in alignment with its lessons. Each day brought new opportunities to practice what I had learned, extending unconditional love, embracing the unknown, and trusting in the interconnectedness of all things. It wasn't a straightforward journey. There were moments of doubt, frustration, and even fear, but through it all, I kept returning to the profound truths I had glimpsed. One of the most challenging lessons was learning to trust. In the realm beyond, trust wasn't something I had to think about, it simply was. I had felt an innate sense of being held, guided, and loved, no matter what. Back in the physical world, though, trust didn't come as easily. I often found myself wanting to control outcomes, to ensure everything went right. But life, with all its unpredictability, had other plans. This struggle came to a head when I faced a major decision about my career. I had been offered a promotion at work, a role that promised financial security and prestige. On paper, it seemed like the logical next step. Yet, something in my heart resisted. The work I had been doing, speaking, volunteering, and connecting with others, felt far more meaningful. But it wasn't lucrative, nor was it stable. Choosing it felt like stepping into the unknown, with no guarantees. For weeks, I wrestled with the decision. I sought advice from friends and family, journaled endlessly, and even tried to meditate for clarity. But the answer didn't come. Finally, one quiet evening, I decided to sit with the uncertainty. I lit a candle, closed my eyes, and simply allowed myself to be. In that stillness, I felt a familiar presence, warm, loving, and steady. The royal figure's words echoed in my mind, "Don't be afraid. Just live your life the best way you can." With that, I knew what I had to do. I declined the promotion and committed fully to the work that truly fed my soul. It was terrifying and liberating all at once. But as the weeks unfolded, opportunities began to appear, unexpected speaking engagements, collaborative projects, and even financial support from generous donors who believed in my mission. It was as if the universe was affirming my choice, reminding me that trust is never misplaced. This experience deepened my understanding of faith, not as blind belief, but as an active, living relationship with the unknown. It taught me that trusting the journey doesn't mean everything will be easy or clear. It means knowing, deep in your heart, that you are supported, even when you can't see how. Around this time, I reconnected with an old friend named Sarah. We had drifted apart over the years, but she reached out after hearing about my story. Over coffee, she shared her struggles with grief and disillusionment following the loss of her partner. "I feel like I'm just going through the motions," she admitted. "I want to believe there's more, but I don't know how." Her vulnerability moved me. I shared my experience with her, not to provide answers, but to offer a perspective. I told her about the unconditional love I had felt, the sense of interconnectedness, and the realization that even our pain has purpose. "You don't have to have all the answers," I said, "just take the next step, whatever that looks like for you." Over time, Sarah found her way back to herself. She began painting again, something she had loved but abandoned in her grief. She also started volunteering at a local shelter, using her own pain as a bridge to connect with others. Watching her transformation was a reminder that healing isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about discovering the beauty in our wholeness, even when it includes scars. My own path continued to evolve. The more I leaned into trust, the more doors seemed to open. I began collaborating with other near-death experiencers, pooling our insights to create workshops and resources for those seeking spiritual growth. These connections felt like threads weaving together a larger tapestry, each of us contributing our unique colors and patterns. One particularly meaningful project was a retreat we organized for people grappling with existential questions. Over the course of a weekend, we guided participants through storytelling, meditation, and exercises designed to foster connection with themselves. each other, and the greater whole. The energy in the room was palpable. A collective acknowledgement of the sacredness of being alive. On the final night, we gathered around a bonfire under a star-filled sky. One by one, participants shared what the experience had meant to them. A man in his 60s, who had recently been diagnosed with a terminal illness, spoke about finding peace for the first time in years. A young woman, who had been estranged from her family, shared her resolve to reach out and rebuild those relationships. Their stories were a testament to the power of community and the human spirit's capacity for resilience. As I listened, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the work we were doing, but for the journey that had led me here. Every twist and turn, every moment of doubt and trust, had been part of a greater plan, and while I couldn't see the full picture, I knew that it was beautiful. Back home, I reflected on how much I had learned since my near-death experience. It wasn't just about what lay beyond this life, it was about how to live this one. To embrace the messiness, the uncertainty, and the beauty of being human. To love boldly, even when it's hard. To trust the journey, even when the path is unclear. And above all, to remember that we are never alone. In our darkest moments, in our brightest joys, we are held by a love that transcends understanding. A love that invites us to keep going, one step at a time, trusting that each step will lead us closer to home. As the years unfolded, I began to see the tapestry of my life with increasing clarity. Each moment, every joy, every sorrow, every decision, had been a thread woven into the greater story of my existence. My near-death experience had been the turning point, a moment of profound revelation that reshaped how I saw the world and my place within it. But the journey wasn't just about the experience itself, it was about what came after. One of the most unexpected lessons was realizing that I wasn't meant to carry this alone. Sharing my story had been transformative, not just for those who listened but for me as well. Each time I recounted my journey, I found new layers of meaning. I began to see how interconnected our lives truly are, how the love and compassion we extend to others ripple outward in ways we may never fully understand. As I continued my work, I often found myself drawn to those who were skeptical, those who, like me before my experience, struggled to believe in anything beyond the tangible. I didn't see it as my role to convince them of anything. Instead, I simply shared what I had seen and felt, leaving space for them to draw their own conclusions. One such encounter stands out in my memory. A man named Richard approached me after one of my talks. He was an astrophysicist, a man of science who had spent his life searching for answers in the stars. "I don't believe in the afterlife," he said bluntly, "but there's something about your story that resonates with me." We talked for hours that evening. He shared his fascination with the universe, his awe at its vastness and complexity. I shared my understanding of that same vastness, not as a scientist but as someone who had glimpsed the divine. "Perhaps," I suggested, "science and spirituality are two sides of the same coin, different languages for describing the same truth." Richard didn't walk away a believer, but he did walk away curious. He began exploring ideas he had once dismissed, opening himself to the possibility that there was more to the universe than he could measure. Watching his journey reminded me that transformation often begins not with certainty, but with a question. In my own life, I continued to grapple with questions of purpose and meaning. What did it truly mean to live a life aligned with the truths I had seen? How could I honor the divine within myself and others in the midst of life's challenges? These weren't questions I could answer once and for all. They were questions I had to live. One of the most profound moments came during a quiet afternoon at home. I was sorting through old photographs when I came across an image of my younger self. In the photo, I was smiling, but I could see the weight of insecurity and self-doubt in my eyes. I thought about how far I had come, how much I had grown, and I realized something. The love I had experienced during my near-death experience, the unconditional, all-encompassing love, wasn't just something I was meant to share with others. It was something I was meant to give to myself. That realization changed everything. I began to see self-love not as selfish, but as sacred. I started treating myself with the same compassion and kindness I offered to others. And in doing so, I found a deeper well of strength and resilience. I learned that you can't pour from an empty cup, and that loving yourself is the first step to truly loving the world. As I approached the later chapters of my life, I felt a sense of peace that I had never known before. Not because life was perfect, it wasn't, but because I understood that perfection wasn't the goal. The goal was to live fully, to love deeply, and to trust that even in the messiness of life, there was beauty. The greatest revelation, however, came in the quiet moments. The moments when I felt the presence of the divine not as a distant figure, but as a quiet whisper in my heart. Those moments reminded me that the connection I had felt during my near-death experience wasn't something I had left behind, it was something I carried with me. Always.